I respond with a bit of surprise, really. I don't think I've ever seen myself as a rebel commander, and nor have I seen myself as a serial rebel. I mean, I think this is only the second time I've ever voted against the government. The first time was on HS2, which in some ways had a local angle to it, as a backbencher. Otherwise, I've never done so. And actually, if you look at what we were voting on, contrary to what some people seem to believe, it was not about stopping Brexit. It was about whether there was going to be a proper process for Brexit, which enabled Parliament at each appropriate stage to have a voice. Because what the government was asking us to do was to give them power to implement an agreement that we don't yet know what that agreement is, and where the government itself had conceded that there was going to have to be another statute enacted by Parliament to approve that agreement. So 12 months before the agreement was coming in, they were asking for powers to already start changing our laws by statutory instrument. And that's what I objected to, because I thought it was frankly unconstitutional. And I tried to persuade the government to amend its own legislation. I mean, I've been quite successful during the course of this bill as we look at what's rather a techie, legal sort of document, to persuade the government to carry out some changes, and I think the bill's been improved, and we've done that by consensus. But on this I failed. They sort of closed down the discussion with me, and it became apparent to me they didn't want to engage, and so I'm afraid at the end of the day I thought it was the right thing to do. I regret having had to do it, but I don't regret having done it.
I remember you kindly spoke to me the day after, on what must have been a very busy morning, and I appreciate that, Mr. Grieve, and you said there were some concessions that were offered, but they were rather late in the day.
They were very late in the day. They were 20 minutes before the vote.
Right,
and it's always very difficult, 20 minutes before the vote, when the debate is still actively taking place in the chamber, to carry out an assessment of whether the concession that you've been offered is in fact worth it. Now, it was a concession, but it didn't actually go to the heart of the issue. It was a concession which said we won't use these powers before Parliament has had a meaningful vote on approving any future deal. But actually, Parliament has to do more than have a meaningful vote to approve any future deal. Parliament has to enact a further statute to implement that deal, and that's the key moment in the process, not just the meaningful vote. So it was a half concession, but my view was, it was a difficult decision to take, was that it was actually rather little and certainly far too late.
Lastly, before we go to the calls, Ian, you're going to be the first caller. Last question from me for now. I've been fairly jocular about describing you as the chief rebel or rebel commander or whatever. Some of the newspapers took a rather different tone. Did that insult you? Did that damage you? Did that surprise you? Did that upset you?
I think I've given up being upset in politics. I think that there is a problem in modern politics at the moment. It is that some newspapers certainly seem to me to fuel an atmosphere of crisis and hatred which isn't justified by rational analysis, and that then gets picked up in social media and you get a deluge of death threats.
Would you say a deluge then?
Well, certainly some of my colleagues have had a deluge. I don't do so.
What's a deluge?
Well, a deluge, I think, is several dozen.
Oh, yeah. How many have you had?
I've had about five.
All as a result of last month?
Five I've reported to the police because they seem to me to be serious enough. There are others which are just streams of invective and anger, but I get plenty of those. I don't worry about those at all. But five which I thought, on the instructions I've been given, I should pass over to the police. Now, bear in mind, I don't do social media. I don't tweet, which is perhaps quite unusual and rather old-fashioned. I've always taken the view I don't really see the point. So those are my colleagues who did vote against the government and who do tweet. They got far more, because on the whole, it's a bit of an inhibition to have to put down an email saying, here's my name and address. And I think
whereas it's like hollering in the street if it's tweeting. Yes.
But there is, I think, a trend towards this kind of violent expression of views. And it's been going on for some time. It's not confined to this. And I think that the media have a responsibility about the way they report. Of course, they're going to criticise if they media think I've done something wrong. The Daily Mail's entitled to express its view on it. But the manner in which that's done and the way it's done has a clear link to the threats you then get. I mean, very frequently you get letters which enclose the newspaper cuttings. So you get the cutting and then accompanying it, you are a traitor, you don't deserve to live, or whatever else.
That's the sort of thing that would make you think.
And so you can see the causal connection. And so in a democracy, of course we have to express our views freely, and that includes expressing our views robustly, although I always try to be polite in the way I do it. But I think that if we, democracy is a pretty robust flower, but it is a flower nevertheless. You can end up crushing it underfoot. And if you get an atmosphere where people can't express their opinion, because actually they're fearful of the sheer level of vitriol and mindless unpleasantness they're going to unleash, then I think we do have a problem. And I think we have to reflect in any contentious issue that we have to try to express ourselves moderately.
Thank you so much. Let's take some calls. Ian in Bristol, you're through to Dominic Grieve. Go ahead, Ian. Morning to you.
Good morning. Good morning, Dominic. Thank you for all your hard work. My head tells me that you are absolutely right. The sovereignty of Parliament must remain supreme. My heart tells me that over the last 50 years, politicians have ceded more and more power to Brussels in, dare I say, a sneaky and rather underhand way, to the point where Parliament is probably little more than a tourist attraction. Why, Dominic, should I now believe that you really want Parliament to be supreme for this, and for me, more importantly, for our children and grandchildren?
Dominic Grieve.
I think you're right that in an interconnected world, the issue of parliamentary sovereignty as a sort of total package of we are gloriously isolated and splendidly isolated is unrealistic. The truth is we share sovereignty all the time. The United Kingdom is signed up to over 800 treaties that have arbitration mechanisms which we've undertaken to observe if there's a dispute over interpretation, quite apart from the EU. I think one has to be realistic about that, but you're right that our membership of the EU requires a pooling of sovereignty. Yes. The question is that in the national interest, and is it being done in a way which is properly scrutinised by Parliament within the parameters that Parliament itself set out in the 72 Act and subsequent acts? That's a political choice. But that doesn't remove one from the fact that if we are enacting legislation at the moment taking us out of the EU, to then chuck the rule book out of the window and to say we're going to give the government extraordinary powers, I mean unprecedented in modern times, to carry this out just because it's righting some sort of supposed wrong, doesn't seem to me to be a good way of approaching this. Ultimately, parliamentary sovereignty we have to be realistic about. I mean, parliamentary sovereignty would mean that if the Queen's prepared to sign off a bill, Parliament, House of Commons and House of Lords, could order people to worship the moon every other Tuesday and say that they should be sentenced to death if they don't. Now, that's just not realistic, fortunately, and I think we'd have people out in the streets and it might be the end of Parliament. So there are limits to all this. My view is that if we want to leave the EU sensibly and make the right choices as we do it, we need to
if we want to leave the EU. Mr. Grieve, clearly the people have said they... Why if, Mr. Grieve?
Well, I used the word if because we are in a process of leaving.
Yeah.
And
you do accept that, don't you?
Yes, of course I do.
Okay,
of course I do. I should make that quite clear.
Yeah, okay. It's just use the word
I could use as we're leaving the EU. It's really important that we should do it by a proper process, because a proper process means that at every stage as you go along, you're likely, as you come up with each question you have to answer, to be in the best position to come up with the right answer to it. You can't guarantee it. But if you start to cut corners, you're going to make mistakes. And that's really what this issue was about when we were debating this bill last month.
Ian, back to you for a quick response before I move on to the next caller.
I'm not convinced that you are actually pro-Brexit. I'm not convinced. We've had the referendum.
Well, he doesn't...
I'm not pro-Brexit.
No, I think... sorry to talk over you. We know he's not. No, and he campaigned against, which is fair enough.
Absolutely clear about this. I believe that Brexit is a mistake. And I think that we're going to find on a cost-benefit analysis, unfortunately, that the cost to us in terms of our well-being outweighs any possible sovereignty or other benefits or even long-term economic benefits we get from it. That's my judgment, and I'm afraid it hasn't changed.
Ian, final point here.
Dominic, if we have 17.6 million people that are going to be ignored or ridden over, they become ungovernable.
Yeah, well, I certainly don't think that the 17.6 million people need to be ignored. And if I may say so, what we're actually doing at the moment is trying to implement what was an expression of desire and to convert that into reality. The difficulty has always been with Brexit that there's a long gap between the expression of desire and the ability to fulfil it. And the detail of how that's carried out was never really discussed or debated, inevitably, during the referendum itself. I mean, this may be a criticism of the referendum process, but we have to live with it. 17.6 million people said they wished to leave the EU. But the detail of what they wanted in future and how they wanted the United Kingdom, where they wanted the UK to be, and how that related to the UK's long-term economic well-being, although some of these issues were debated, it's almost inevitable that as time goes on, all sorts of new problems and issues arise. So we as parliamentarians can only do our best to try to implement this decision and to do it as we see for the best national interest. And of course, there are all sorts of contentious issues here, and I recognise that. I have some colleagues who think that some forms of Brexit are better than others. And there are deep divisions across all political parties, and I've never existed or been involved in politics in a time of greater uncertainty and anxiety in many ways. We have to do our best to try and navigate our way through that, and that's what I'm trying to do.
Ian, thank you. We must get other people involved. Philip's in Windsor. Philip, you're through to Dominic Grieve. Go ahead, Philip.
Good morning, Nick. Morning, Dominic.
Hello, sir.
Dominic, I don't doubt the reason you did what you did, and I don't question your right to do so. But I would say that you were possibly under no illusions about the significance of what it was you were doing in terms of the impact on the government. Why did you not resign as a Tory MP, given that you were taking such a significant step against party line?
Because I'm a Tory. I've been a Tory all my life. I'm a Conservative, born, bred, brought up. I don't belong to any other political party. I'm a Conservative to my fingertips and trying to act in a Conservative fashion. Jen, just picking up your second point, what was the impact on the government? I mean, I realise that people are so...
Well, it was her first defeat. She was weakened, surely.
Nobody wishes to see the government which they support defeated. But I have to say, I did do it, yes. And I also made a judgment about the extent to which it might weaken her in a way which I would regard as being unsatisfactory. I don't think it has. She went off to Brussels the following day, concluded the first stage of the negotiations and moved on to the second. What the vote has ensured is that when we come back to consider the agreement, which I hope very much she gets at the end of next year, we will be able to deal with that in a proper process system. You see, you need to look at the other way of approaching this, which is that the situation is so critical that nobody is allowed to say a word of dissent if they think their own government, which they support, is doing something mistaken. Now, that's not what democracy is about. And one of the things which alarms me a little bit is I get letters from people saying, well, you know, in view of the circumstances and the national crisis, everybody should be supporting the government at every moment by every turn. Well, if we start doing that, then the benefits of having a democracy and a chamber in Parliament and the ability of MPs to try to debate things goes out of the window. So the government wasn't threatened by my act. The government, I mean, my view is the Prime Minister is likely to be in office till 2022. The only thing which is going to bring down this government is if the DUP were to withdraw from their agreement on supply and confidence. Otherwise, I don't see any prospect of the current Conservative government being brought down.
Quick response from you, Philip.
I think that's a bit glib. I mean, you say you're a Tory to your fingertips, and then the moment an issue of such significance turns up, you're Dominic Grieve. I suggest that the voters of Beaconsfield might like to have a view on it. And why not give them the chance if you're such a Democrat?
I mean, I have to put to you, of course, Philip, thank you. We've looked in, and you'll know this better than I, but you do actually represent a Leave constituency by the slimmest of margins. I have it as...
I don't actually.
50.7 plays 49.3?
No. We go round and round the houses about this. I represent a district, the entirety of a district, South Bucks, which voted in the way you've described.
50.7 plays 40, which is about as close as you can get.
You can get as close as you can get, 700 votes in it. But I also represent quite a substantial chunk of Wickham district.
I see, apologies.
Which I have to say, the bit of Wickham I represent, which is Marlow and Bourne End, appears on the statistical evidence to be a hotbed of Remain.
OK, fair enough.
The aggregate of the two together,
I see.
The general view... you can't be absolutely certain, but I think it's the constituency voted to remain by a narrow margin.
Point well made. Thank you for your call. On to Tony in Windsor. Tony, you're on the radio. Good morning.
Yeah, just echoing what Philip said. I mean, I'm in Windsor now, but I used to be a constituent, and few times when you could get to see him.
Yeah, it's a bad line. You used to be one of Mr. Grieve's constituents, I think you're saying, Tony?
Yeah, going back quite a few years.
Yep.
From 97 probably till about sort of 7 or 8 years ago.
Right.
I mean, Mr. Grieve has always been a Euro fanatic, and, that's commonly known. And when I raised the subject with him in his constituency, his general response used to be just look at his watch and yawn and hope that I'd go away.
Right.
That really
so my listeners, just to remind them, where has he displayed his Euro fanaticism? Just so we can nail Mr. Grieve on that.
Well, I think people know his constituency and I mean, he used to be fairly close with
It's a terrible line. People his constituents. Can we get Tony any clearer? Can he hear me? Tony? No? Right. We're going to try and get Tony in a better area to explore Dominic Grieve's Euro fanaticism because he was grinning at that. So hold that thought, Mr. Grieve. Chris is at the bank while we try and get Tony in a better place. Chris, you're on the radio through to Dominic Grieve. Go ahead.
Good morning, Dominic. Yeah, I mean, I voted for Brexit, but I'm happy for you to have a meaningful vote or a second referendum. Totally get the idea of Parliament being sovereign. Just really want to understand what is the question that's going to be on the table, because it seems to me that lots of Remainers out there, especially people like Vince Cable, who want an option on the table to say, we'll just forget about Brexit, we'll ignore what the will of the people was. Parliament voted on this, and invoked Article 50, so, whether or not we're going to leave is kind of settled. So would you agree that we should take that off the table completely? The choice should be between, are we going to accept the deal that Theresa May negotiates, or are we going to reject that and go with a hard Brexit, pay nothing to the EU? That should really be what the question is on the table.
What might the question be? We're a little ahead of ourselves here. Dominic Grieve.
Chris, it's a bit hypothetical because we simply don't know where we're going to be at the end of this year when I think the critical decisions are going to have to be made. I think I rather agree with you. I think the likelihood is that the choice that's going to face Parliament is between the deal that the government has succeeded in putting together. And bear in mind, it's not the permanent deal. It's likely to be the transitional deal under which we leave for a 2-year period. We don't know at the moment. I mean, these are all part of the uncertainties. We haven't a clue what the long-term relationship between the EU and the UK is going to be, and whether or not we can negotiate a relationship which keeps the economic benefits of EU membership whilst getting rid of the things that people don't like about it. I simply don't know. I fear this is going to go on for another 5, 6, 7 years. I'm not even sure.
When you say this, what the whole? You mean the whole horse trading?
Process? Well, the whole process of negotiating a long-term relationship between ourselves and the EU. I don't think it's about to end at the end of next year, but there will be choices at the end of next year, and I rather agree with Chris that I think that's likely to be the choice. But it's possible there might be other choices on the table. I simply don't know. And Parliament, as the guardian of our constitution and of people's rights, needs, I think, to just be open-minded about what the options might be. But one thing I'm quite clear about is that in the light of the referendum result that took place in 2016, Parliament cannot ignore that result. It just can't. It would be wrong, and we should not do so. The only options, if you wanted to review that result, would either have to be a general election where that issue arises, or it would have to be another referendum.
You're sounding like Tony Blair, Mr. Grieve.
Well, I don't wish to sound particularly like Tony Blair, because maybe I did, but the issue is those the only way.
But that's exactly what he said yesterday, Dominic Grieve.
Yeah, but hold on a moment. Where I think I and Mr. Blair may differ is I'm not recommending this as a course of action. The point I'm trying to make is that it has to be, if there is to be a change. I mean, just suppose for a moment that by September, October next year, opinion polls suggest, I have no reason to think this is going to happen, that 80% of the population thought that a mistake had been made and they wanted something other than leaving the EU. What does Parliament do then? Does Parliament turn around and say, well, terribly sorry, you made that decision in 2016, so forget about that, we're off without a deal in in March 2019? Or does Parliament and government try to respond to that? And this has always been the problem with a referendum. I mean, if people vote in an election, 2 years later they're entitled to change their mind and to say, well, excuse me, we voted you in 2 years ago, but we're going to kick you out next year. The sooner there's an election, the better. But referendums have sort of have this sort of seizing something and turning it into stone. And I think you've got to be very careful about this. My view is, my best prediction is that we will end up with an agreement with the government, by the government, which I hope is a reasonable one to go into transition, and we will leave, having operated all these bits of legislation that the government's put together, in March 2019 as expected. But we're then going to go into a 2-year transition period, and there is uncertainty as to what the final deal will be at the end of it. That, I think, is the likely roadmap. But all I'm saying is that as a Member of Parliament with a responsibility towards my electorate, I don't just switch off at that point and say, I'm not going to do any more thinking about the long-term future of the United Kingdom in view of what's going on around us. I don't think that's the right approach. I need to keep an open mind and also listen to what my constituents are saying to me.
What did Mr Blair bring to the debate yesterday, would you say, Mr Grieve?
Probably not very much, because I'm afraid that Mr Blair historically has... his reputation is so damaged by a number of issues not really related to Brexit that I'm not sure he's in a position to make a very helpful contribution to this debate. I'm afraid it's a hard thing to say, but I think it's the truth.
Chris, thank you for your call. We've got Tony in Windsor back. Tony, can we move you straight to your question? You're the former constituent of Mr Grieve some years ago. What's your question, sir?
Yeah, I just think this is all about Dominic Grieve himself as an individual, Dominic. I mean, this is nothing sort of personal, but I think it's just all about you, grandstanding. I mean, you called a lot of your colleagues unhinged regarding their views over Brexit, but I think you've got a lot more in common with Tony Blair than you let on. You voted for the war in Iraq. You've always been a Euro fanatic like him. Yeah. I think you need to... Yeah, you have.
Well, I haven't.
Let's get Mr Grieve in. Tony, I'll keep you on the line. Dominic Grieve.
Tony, the idea that I've been a Euro fanatic is astonishing. I think I've been classified for years as a Eurosceptic. I voted against the Lisbon Treaty. I've challenged the government on many areas of detail of EU policy. And I happen to think the EU, particularly in the way it developed after the Euro came in, is flawed. I'm absolutely clear about this. I think the EU has many, many things wrong with it, and which I will want to see addressed. But I have to say that when it came to the referendum, and you have to make the cost-benefit analysis of whether participation is better than withdrawal, my view was that participation was better. And I have to say, since then, nothing has happened to change my view about it. But I recognise that lots of perfectly reasonable people took a different view. And I don't take the view that the people who did it were sort of anti-immigrant xenophobes. Those in my constituency had a wide range of reasons why they decided to vote to leave, and I'm perfectly respectful of that. So I certainly don't share Mr Blair's rather starry-eyed views of the EU, or certainly the way he communicated it when he was Prime Minister. Indeed, as I say, I'm on record on numerous occasions as expressing my concerns about some of the direction of travel and some of the things that the UK unnecessarily signed up to when we were members of the EU when he was Prime Minister.
Let's go to some of the texts, tweets and emails, Mr Grieve. Rachel in Bexley says, I read that the day after the vote, Dominic Grieve had to eat breakfast on his own because all his Conservative chums refused to sit with him. How upset was he?
I wasn't upset because it didn't happen. And this just shows how inventive some coverage can be. I went in the following morning to the tea room, and some of my colleagues were sitting round one of the tea tables where you have breakfast, and I sat down with them, and we chatted amiably, and then, as happens over breakfast, they drifted off.
People get up and go.
Get up and go. And there came a point when I was the last person sitting at the table reading the newspaper, because I'd come in last, and therefore I was the last person to go. There was no suggestion that he'd agree. Let's put it this way. If they were attempting to indicate to me their displeasure by getting up and walking out the moment I came in, I didn't realise that was happening.
Kenneth in Dartford, has Dominic Grieve had any contact with the Prime Minister since that vote?
Very brief contact with the Prime Minister since that vote, and I'm likely, because of my other roles as Chairman of the Intelligence and Security Committee, to have some further contact with her in due course. But no, I haven't had a proper conversation with her.
But it was cordial.
The very short exchange of words I had with her was perfectly polite.
Very short exchange of words. How are you? Something like that.
It was good evening, I think. So.
All right, let's go to another call. Luke in Nottingham, you're on the radio through to Dominic Grieve. Luke, go ahead.
Good morning. I'm going to go in the slightly opposite vein, probably, to the previous calls, and say that I'm a former Conservative member who was put off the party by the way that they have embraced basically the comments that you've already heard. People that are now describing you as a Euro fanatic, people that are dismissive of any opinion that goes outside of what used to be confined at least to UKIP and now appears to be defying the Conservative Party. How, in that environment, can you continue to stay motivated as a Conservative politician and to support and push forward this agenda, which is ultimately what the party campaigned against while you were in government?
I agree that it's an issue, Luke. I mean, my concern has been, I noticed that in Conservative associations there's a trickle of resignations of membership from people who share the sort of view that you have. I've noticed it. I've noticed it with my own association. Of course, there are also some people who've written in after what I did, saying that they will never vote for me again because I'm a traitor. But I think we shouldn't ignore the fact that all political parties, to be successful, have to be broad churches. And the Conservative Party has never excluded people who see close cooperation with our European partners as being a sensible destiny for the United Kingdom and very much in our national interest. And it would worry me very much if we were to do that, because I think we will all be damaged as a result. And a party that narrows its base, as we know has happened with Labour in the past, is incapable of being re-elected at a general election.
Luke, thank you. Let's get one more last question in from the listeners, and perhaps one from me if we can hold you for an extra couple of minutes. Karen's in Islington. Karen, your question to Dominic Grieve.
Hello. I'd like to ask how Mr. Grieve stands up to the vilification and abuse he's received. Like Luke, I'm glad to hear that there are people out there who agree with you, support you, and think that you have done an extremely courageous thing. I'm not a Conservative voter, but I feel that I'm right there behind you, and there are a lot of people who feel the way I do. I think the Ramonas, as we're known, are far too polite, and we need to stand up and be counted. How do you deal with it on a day-to-day basis, I wondered?
Mr. Grieve.
Thank you very much. I have to say that, 21 years in Parliament, and I think you start to acquire quite a tough hide, and you just have to accept it. I've been a minister in government, I've had to make some difficult decisions, and you just have to accept it. Does it take a bit of a toll? Yes, it probably does. I think by the time I got to Christmas, I was very tired and quite stressed out. But I've taken a few days off after Christmas, and I'm sort of ready and raring to go again. And in a funny way, politicians run on adrenaline. It's a very strange phenomenon as to what motivates us and keeps us going. And so if you think that you've got something useful to say and it's worth saying, then you've just got to get on and say it.
A couple of questions from me before I let you go. You mentioned earlier, Mr. Grieve, you chair the Intelligence and Security Select Committee. I'm sure you, like all of my listeners and most of the country, would agree that Met Commissioner Cressida Dick has done a fantastic job, but we come out of a horrific year last year for the terror attacks, not just here in London but elsewhere. What will your committee be doing in the light of those?
We, as a priority, we're going to review the response that the police generally around the country had to the terrorist attacks and whether there are lessons to be learnt. Worth bearing in mind, there's already been quite a lot of internal review and some of it validated.
Worth bearing in mind, 6 attacks have been fought.
Yes,
we need to look at the other. It's tragic that one gets through, but we need to look at the other side of the coin.
We have to be realistic. There is not 100%. We cannot guarantee 100% security. You only have to look at the nature of these attacks to see how difficult they are. These aren't complex plots where people are necessarily accumulating explosives and communicating with each other. This is somebody who goes out and hires a car and decides to drive it into...
It's phenomenal the jobs that have been done stopping them.
So it's been astonishingly successful, but that's not to say that there are not lessons that can't be learnt, and indeed the internal review shows quite clearly and that there are some lessons that can be learnt. So we're going to look at that. I don't want to go over the old ground all over again into some sort of lengthy 12-month, 18-month inquiry. By the time you publish, it's no longer relevant. But we are going to look and see what has happened and whether there's more that we can usefully add as a committee and publish, obviously, because we try to publish our reports into the public domain. We can't always put everything out to the public, but we will be looking at that as a priority. So we're very well aware that our security services are having to work very hard to deal with this, and of course they're also having to deal with other threats as well, not related to terrorism, and we mustn't ignore that either.
OK. A lot of calls came in which I didn't put to air, but you just remind everybody you're Conservative MP for Beaconsfield. A lot of people in Buckinghamshire asking where you stand on HS2 and whether you're wholly convinced of the merits of that.
I'm afraid I'm not. I indicated earlier that I voted against HS2 at a late stage when I was back on the back benches, and I didn't have that opportunity when I was in government. My concern is it has an adverse environmental impact, but I think one's got to bear in mind that any infrastructure development is going to have that, and it may still be justified. After all, my constituents don't write to me saying, please plough up the M40, even though the impact of the M40 through my constituency is much worse than HS2 is ever going to be. But that said, I do worry, coming back to cost-benefit analyses, I do worry about the astonishing cost of this project and whether, in fact, it is going to deliver the benefits. Of course, it's having a fast rail service to the north of England and ultimately to Scotland will have great benefits. But it's a huge sum of money. And my instinct throughout all this, and the cost has gone rising year on year and still rising, is wouldn't we be better spending this money on upgrading existing rail lines and infrastructure? That's not to say that we will never do an HS2, but have we got our priorities right? And I've remained very, very uncertain about that. and troubled that we are spending such a vast sum, particularly at a time when the availability of vast sums of money is quite limited.
And lastly, you mentioned you're on the backbenches. You are a former Attorney General. You will have been anticipating this question. What person who's said to be one of Britain's most prolific serial sex offenders is released after 8 and a bit years. Is that too... I speak, of course, of John Warboys. Is that too soon?
A very difficult question to answer. It's worth bearing in mind that he was given an indeterminate sentence, but he was also given a tariff. This is the system when you have somebody who is dangerous. The tariff was 8 years, which is the same as getting a 16-year determinate sentence, because remember, all people with determinate sentences get released at the 50% point. He was kept in for 2 years beyond that, and the parole board has then done an evaluation, which they're going to have to justify, saying that he is safe to be released. Now, at the time he got this sentence, I don't remember people saying that the tariff and linked to the indeterminate sentence was wrong. And of course, he can be recalled at any time.
Some anti-rape groups did make representations to Baroness Scotland.
Scotland.
Yeah.
But I don't think. I mean, my understanding is that it stood. It could have been potentially reviewed, and it didn't. So, yeah, I find this a very difficult issue. The parole board has a very difficult burden in this. But equally, one of the things that has been coming out is suggestions that he's in fact allegedly assaulted large numbers of other people. But the parole board can't take that into account. I mean, if there is evidence that he's assaulted other women, then he ought to be prosecuted for that. And doubtless if that were to happen, we might get a situation where his tariff was entirely different. But we have to recognise that if you impose a tariff on an indeterminate sentence, then the principle is when the tariff is expired, 8 years, the parole board is looking to release that person if it is considered safe to do so, with, of course, the possibility that at any time for the rest of their life, they could be recalled to prison if their behaviour was giving cause for concern.
Will we see the parole board's workings, for want of a better expression? Well, Yvette Cooper is saying we should be made aware of what decision-making process.
I think there may well be a possibility of that. I mean, it's difficult. Normally, the parole board, for understandable reasons, works privately. But I think that if a common select committee asks to have an understanding of how the parole board came to its decision, which I think is what Yvette Cooper was indicating, then it ought to be possible to get a proper understanding. And I can make quite clear these were appalling crimes, and particularly linked to his work, likely to cause major public disquiet, so that people should be anxious and concerned about his release is entirely understandable, and it must really be for the parole board to justify this decision.
And lastly, how fair is it that Sir Keir Starmer as he was, is attracting a bit of flack, because it would appear that his office, not necessarily he, but his office, did not prefer further charges when he was DPP?
I think it's a bit unfair, because he's in no position, having ceased to be DPP for some time, to answer this question. I haven't the slightest idea what was happening 9 years ago. It's even before I was Attorney General. You mentioned Baroness Scotland, my predecessor. I have no idea what the evidence was presented to the Crown Prosecution Service about whether there were other charges that could be preferred. The police, I think, are the people who came up with the suggestion of 102 victims. And I think, if I may say so, the police need to be a bit careful about this. I mean, if there are 102 victims and there is evidence which should be put to the Crown Prosecution Service, I very much hope it happened. Otherwise, I think one's got to be careful about making generalised assertions rather than just relying on what is the evidence against an individual.
Can I just say you're one of the easiest going rebel commanders I've ever spent any time with. Dominic Grieve, thank you very much for appearing. Conservative MP Dominic Grieve on LBC, where news with Simon Conway is next.
The Conservative MP Dominic Grieve has told LBC he's passed 5 death threats he's received to the police. The former Attorney General says they were sent to him after he led a rebellion on Brexit in the Commons last month. It's emerged victims of serial sex offender